At my husband's promotion party, I watched him stand in the corner with his hand resting low on another woman's back, and when I stepped closer, he didn't pull away. He looked straight at me and said if I didn't like it, I could leave. It was a Thursday evening in early March, warm for Charleston, the kind of night people call perfect without thinking too hard about it. The patio lights stretched across the backyard of a restored brick house Grant's company had rented for the celebration. There were maybe 40 people, most of them from his firm, a few neighbors, and my cousin Brooke, who had come only because I asked her to. I remember thinking just minutes before everything shifted that this was the first time in a long while I didn't feel like I had to explain anything about my life. Grant had just been promoted to regional manager, and this party was supposed to mark a new chapter for him, for us. I was standing near the drinks table talking to Brooke about a property she'd been trying to close in Savannah when my eyes drifted across the patio. It wasn't intentional, just one of those small unconscious movements you make when your body is used to tracking someone. That was when I saw them. Grant was standing close to a woman I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't seen her in years. Ivy Lane, his ex, the one he had once described as someone from a different life. They were facing each other not like acquaintances catching up, but like two people who had never really learned how to keep their distance. His hand was moving slowly along her back, not in a way that could be mistaken for friendly, not in a way a husband forgets his wife might see. Brooke followed my gaze and went still beside me. She didn't say anything, but I could feel the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders squared, as if she was already preparing for something. I didn't wait for it to turn into a scene. I walked across the patio, steady, not fast, not slow, just enough for people nearby to notice without understanding why. When I reached them, I placed my hand lightly on Grant's shoulder, the same way I had done 100 times before in quieter moments. He didn't move his hand away from Ivy. I looked at him and asked calmly if they needed more space. He turned his head, and there was a brief second where I expected something, recognition maybe, or the smallest hint that he understood what he was doing. Instead, he held my gaze and said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. If you can't handle this, or me spending weekends with my ex, then you can leave. No hesitation, no attempt to soften it, no glance at the people standing within earshot. Behind me, I could feel Brooke step closer, but I lifted my hand slightly, just enough to stop her without turning around. I didn't argue. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting the way he expected. I just stood there for a moment longer, looking at a man I had been married to for 8 years, and realized that whatever I thought we were holding together had already slipped past the point where it could be fixed by another conversation. We left the party 10 minutes later. Brooke drove. I sat in the passenger seat watching the lights of downtown Charleston blur into long, quiet lines. Neither of us spoke at first. There wasn't anything either of us could say that would make what had just happened smaller. After a while, Brooke asked me softly if I was going home. I looked out at the road ahead and said no, not tonight. She didn't ask where we were going instead. She just nodded and kept driving like she understood that whatever came next wasn't going to be something I could explain in a single sentence, and for the first time that night, I heard my own voice again, steady and clear, saying something I hadn't planned to say out loud. I think I'm going to leave. Not the party, not just the house, everything. Brooke took me to her townhouse instead of asking more questions, and sometime after 11, she set a mug of chamomile tea in front of me and waited. That was what I had always appreciated about her. Brooke never rushed into people's pain like it was a conversation she had earned just by being present. She was my older cousin by 4 years, practical to the point of bluntness, the kind of woman who could walk through a house once and tell you whether the foundation had shifted. She had built a strong career in coastal Georgia real estate by trusting what held and what didn't. That night, she looked at me the same way, as if she were waiting for me to decide whether I was finally ready to admit what had been unstable for a long time. I sat at her kitchen table with my coat still on my purse on the floor by my feet and my phone face down between us. Grant had called twice while we were driving. I hadn't answered. He hadn't texted. For a while, neither of us said anything. I kept staring at the steam rising from the tea, watching it disappear into the light over Brooke's stove, and trying to understand why I didn't feel shattered in the way I thought I would. Hurt, yes. Humiliated, certainly. But underneath that, there was something calmer and stranger than grief. Relief. Not relief at what had happened. Relief that something had finally happened clearly enough that I could no longer explain it away. Brooke leaned back in her chair and asked in the same steady tone she used when clients were about to make expensive mistakes whether I meant what I had said in the car. I told her yes. Then I heard myself say something else, something I had kept folded up inside me for months because saying it aloud would have made it real. I told her there were papers, not divorce papers, not yet, a different set. Papers I had been putting off because every time I tried to imagine signing them, I could already hear Grant's voice telling me I was rushing over complicating things, trying to build a life he had never asked for. Brooke did not interrupt. I got my laptop from my bag, opened it on her kitchen table, and pulled up the folder I had not looked at in nearly 3 months. The file names were still there, neat and waiting. Purchase draft, studio lease agreement, business registration checklist, a home inspection report from Savannah. The image of that list alone made my chest tighten. The property was a narrow white house on a quiet street just outside downtown Savannah, with a small detached carriage house in the back that could be converted into a therapy studio. It wasn't grand. That wasn't what I had wanted. I had wanted something stable, useful, and mine. For almost 2 years, I had been talking in hesitant pieces about opening a pediatric sensory practice of my own instead of continuing to work under someone else's schedule. I already had the credentials. I already had enough savings for a down payment. What I didn't have was a husband who could imagine a future that didn't center him. Brooke nodded slowly as I walked her through it. I told her how I had found the place in December, how I'd spoken to a lender, how I had nearly gone down to see it in person. Then Grant had said Savannah was too far, that Charleston was where our life was, that this was not the right time, that maybe later when things settled down, later. It was the word he always used when the sacrifice needed to be mine. Brooke turned the laptop slightly toward herself and scanned the documents without touching anything. Then she looked back at me and asked one question. Was it still available? I said I didn't know. The listing had been active the last time I checked, but I had stopped looking because I told myself that was what marriage required. I had said no to my own plans so many times that eventually I stopped calling it a decision and started calling it patience. Brooke picked up her phone and after asking permission with a glance texted the listing agent. She knew him professionally. Nothing dramatic, nothing secretive, just a short message sent before midnight to find out whether the property was still under consideration. Then she set the phone down and folded her hands. If it's there, she said quietly, you need to decide whether you've been waiting for the right time or waiting for permission. That was the sentence that followed me all the way to the guest room she made up for me. I lay awake for a long time, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. My phone stayed silent on the nightstand. Grant still hadn't texted. And sometime in the dark, before sleep finally came, I understood that what hurt most wasn't that he had told me I could leave. It was that I had been arranging my whole life around a man who had already made peace with the idea. By the time I closed my eyes, I knew one thing with a clarity I had not had in years. If those papers were still waiting for me, I was going to open them again. Brooke was already awake when I came into the kitchen on Friday morning, dressed for work, her hair clipped back, one hand wrapped around a travel mug while the other scrolled through emails on her phone. She looked up when she heard me and said the listing agent had replied just after 7. The house in Savannah was still available. No contract yet, no backup offer. If I wanted to see it, Brooke could drive down with me early the following week. I nodded, but I didn't answer right away. I was holding the edge of the counter so lightly that I didn't realize my fingers had gone cold until Brooke set the coffee pot down and looked at me more closely. Tell me something, she said. Did last night start this, or did it just make it impossible to ignore? That question stayed in the room between us longer than anything else had. I sat down at the table again this time, without my coat, without my purse, without the need to pretend I was only passing through. Brooke pulled out the chair across from me, and I opened my phone for the first time that morning. There were 3 texts from Grant. "Where are you? Are you still upset? Come home so we can talk." Nothing about what he had said, nothing about Ivy, nothing that suggested he understood the difference between a disagreement and humiliation. I set the phone down and told Brooke the truth. Last night had not started this. It had only made it visible. Once I said that other things started rising to the surface, not dramatic memories, not one unforgettable betrayal I could point to cleanly, but smaller moments I had filed away because that was easier than stopping my life to examine them. Grant had been busy almost every weekend for months. Not every single one, but enough that I had learned to stop asking too many questions if I wanted the house to stay peaceful. Sometimes it was golf with clients, sometimes a last-minute dinner with a vendor. Sometimes he said he needed to show his face at some informal work gathering that somehow never included spouses. As I spoke, Brooke listened the way she always did when she was trying to determine whether something was coincidence or structure. She asked whether it had always been weekends. I thought about that. Weekends, yes, mostly Saturdays, almost always with enough notice to sound casual, but not enough for me to make my own plans first. Grant had a way of framing those absences as if they had simply appeared around him, and he was being pulled into them by obligation. I used to believe that, or at least I behaved as if I did. Then another detail came back to me. A month earlier, on a Sunday afternoon, I had called him because the dishwasher was leaking into the kitchen floor. He answered on the second ring and said he was across town meeting a colleague for drinks. I remembered that clearly because I had looked at the clock when he said it, just after 4. But later that evening, when he came home, there had been a faint sweetness on his shirt, not perfume exactly, but something floral and expensive that did not belong to any bar I had ever been in. At the time, I had noticed it and kept moving. Now, sitting in Brooke's kitchen with morning light falling across the table, I remembered something else. 2 Saturdays ago, Grant had left in a navy quarter-zip and loafers, saying he was meeting a client from Atlanta for lunch near the marina. That same afternoon, while I was folding laundry, Ivy's face had appeared in the corner of my phone screen through a local fitness studio post. She was standing outside a restaurant downtown Charleston, smiling into the camera in oversized sunglasses. I had not thought much of it then. Charleston was not a large city in the ways that mattered. People crossed paths, places overlapped, but Brooke asked me where the restaurant was, and when I told her, she went quiet. "That's nowhere near the marina," she said. The sentence landed harder than I wanted it to. Not because it proved anything. It didn't, not yet, but because for the first time the discomfort I had been treating like a mood began to resemble a pattern. I looked at my phone again, then turned it face down. "I don't know what it means," I said. Brooke nodded once. "You don't have to know yet." That was the only thing that made the next breath possible. Because by then I understood something I had spent a long time avoiding. Sometimes the first clue is not what someone did. It's the moment you realize how much of yourself you trained to look away. By Saturday morning, Grant was already gone. He had left before I woke up, or at least before I opened my eyes long enough to register the quiet. The house felt different without him. Not emptier exactly, just uninterrupted. No footsteps overhead, no cabinet doors closing too hard, no background presence I had learned to move around without thinking. There was a text on my phone when I finally reached for it. "Out for a bit. Don't wait up." No explanation, no reference to the night before, no acknowledgement of what he had said in front of everyone. I stared at the message longer than it deserved, then set the phone aside and got out of bed. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to follow the routine we had built together. I didn't make coffee for 2. I didn't check what was in the fridge to plan meals around his schedule. I moved through the house quietly, as if I were already a guest in it. By 10, I was standing in the bedroom with the closet door open. I hadn't planned that moment, not in a dramatic sense. There was no sudden decision, no surge of emotion that pushed me toward action. It was simpler than that. I looked at the space where my things were mixed with his, and for the first time I noticed how little of it felt entirely mine. I reached for the small, fireproof box on the top shelf, the one we had agreed to keep important documents in. I carried it to the bed and opened it slowly, half expecting to feel something sharper than what came. Birth certificate, passport, social security card, copies of my credentials, everything exactly where I had left it. I placed them in a neat stack beside me, then pulled my laptop from the nightstand and opened the folder Brooke and I had looked at the night before. The papers were still there. I didn't open them yet. I just let them sit on the screen, real and waiting. Downstairs, the house stayed quiet. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Grant. Might be late. Don't make plans. I read it once and felt something shift, not anger, not even frustration, but a clearer understanding of the pattern I had been describing to Brooke. It wasn't just that he left. It was that he assumed I would remain in place, adjusting around his absence, like it was part of the structure of our lives. I didn't respond. Instead, I moved back to the closet and pulled a suitcase from the corner. It was the same one we had used for short trips over the years, still holding the faint scent of hotel detergent and compressed time. I set it on the bed and unzipped it, the sound louder than it should have been in an otherwise silent room. I didn't start packing right away. I stood there looking at the open suitcase and understood that once I placed something inside, it would stop being a thought and become a direction. So I started with the things that required no explanation. Documents, my laptop, a folder with my licenses and certifications, the essentials of a life that existed independently of marriage. Each item went in carefully without rush, without hesitation. By mid-afternoon, the bed was half covered with what I had chosen to take and what I had left behind, clothes I wore for work, a few personal items, nothing Grant had bought me, nothing that felt like it belonged to a version of myself I was no longer certain I recognized. The house still hadn't changed. No calls, no questions, no sign that anything was different on his end. At 4, I checked my phone again. A location notification flickered briefly on the screen from an app we had set up years ago for convenience. Something we had both forgotten about until moments like this. Grant's location pinged across town, not near the office, not near any place he had ever mentioned for work, just a quiet residential area I had seen on a map before without thinking twice about it. I watched the dot for a few seconds before the screen dimmed. Then I set the phone down and closed the suitcase halfway, because by then the pressure I felt wasn't coming from what I had discovered. It was coming from how little room was left to pretend I hadn't. By Monday morning, the sky over Interstate 95 was the flat, pale gray of a day that hadn't decided what season it belonged to yet, and Brooke drove with both hands on the wheel and no music on. We left Charleston before sunrise. I had packed only what I needed for one day and one answer. My document folder rested on my lap, the whole drive held in both hands like something that might still disappear if I loosened my grip. Inside were the papers from the fireproof box, my banking information, my license documents, and the printed property file I had reopened only 3 nights earlier. Neither of us talked much until we crossed into Georgia. Then Brooke glanced over and said the closing attorney's office was expecting us at 10:30, and after that she had arranged for me to meet a family law attorney in Savannah named Daniel Mercer. He handled separation and asset division quiet cases, mostly the kind where people still wore decent clothes and tried to call destruction transition. I gave a small nod and looked back out the window. Grant had texted twice on Sunday night and once that morning. "You still doing this? Where were you all weekend? Call me before I get home tonight." That last message had sat on my screen long enough to make my stomach turn. Not because I was afraid of him, because even now, after Thursday, after Saturday, after everything that had shifted in me, he still wrote as if I were the one stepping outside the marriage while he remained at its center. By the time we reached Savannah, I felt something colder than anger. I felt time narrowing. The office was on the second floor of an old building near Monterey Square, with polished wooden floors and framed maps of historic property lines on the walls. The closing attorney, a woman named Ellen Pierce, greeted me with the calm efficiency of someone who had watched people change their lives at conference tables for a living. She did not ask why I had come alone. She only confirmed my name, reviewed the final numbers, and turned the stack of papers toward me one section at a time. Purchase agreement, transfer terms, closing disclosures, studio lease assignment for the carriage house and back. My name appeared over and over again in places that had once felt too bold to imagine. I signed slowly at first, not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I understood exactly what each line meant. This was not revenge in the way people use the word when they want drama. No raised voice, no speech, no public humiliation, just a legal record of a future that no longer required Grant's permission. Halfway through the packet, Ellen slid the deed copy into view, and something in me went very still. That was the moment. Not when I packed the suitcase, not when I left the party, not even when I watched his location settle across town on Saturday afternoon. It was there, at that table in Savannah with a black pen in my hand and my own name fixed to a property, a business address, a direction. I realized I was no longer waiting to see whether my marriage could be saved. I was signing into a life that would exist whether it survived or not. When the last page was done, Ellen gathered the documents into neat piles and said the recorded copy would be ready later that day. She handed me the keys in a small envelope along with a stamped set of closing papers. Outside, Brooke hugged me once hard and brief. Then she drove me 3 blocks to Daniel Mercer's office. He was in his late 50s, precise without being cold, and he listened without interrupting as I explained only the facts that mattered. The house in Charleston was a rental. The joint utilities were in both names. My savings account was separate. The marriage had lasted 8 years. I had no children. He asked whether I wanted confrontation or protection. I answered before I could soften it. Protection. He nodded as if that were the more difficult and wiser choice and began outlining the steps. Separate records. Preserve access. Do not announce anything too early. Move carefully. Let paper speak before emotion does. When I walked back outside, the envelope with the house keys was in one hand and the stamped papers were in the other. For years, I had called my silence patience. By that afternoon, I knew better. It had only been silence until the moment I signed. After that, it became a boundary. By Wednesday afternoon, the house in Savannah no longer felt like a closing file or a possibility. It felt lived in, though only barely. There were still unopened boxes lined against the wall in the front room, my suitcase half unpacked near the stairs, and a thin layer of dust on the windowsills that caught the light whenever a truck passed outside. The carriage house and back still smelled faintly of old paint and warm wood, and every time I stepped into it, I could feel the outline of the therapy studio it might become. Not finished, not polished, but real. That was the difference. For 2 days, I had moved through the space with the quiet focus of someone doing triage on her own life. Utilities transferred, passwords changed, personal documents locked in the top drawer of the built-in desk in the dining room. Daniel Mercer had emailed a checklist that morning with the next steps highlighted in yellow preserve records, separate finances where appropriate document communication, do not argue by phone. I had followed every instruction, which was why the message from Grant felt so strange when it came in at 2:14 p.m. "What do you want for dinner tonight?" I stared at the screen long enough for it to dim in my hand. No apology, no question about why I hadn't come home Monday night, no mention of my silence, my absence the side of the closet that was now empty, or the fact that my car was no longer in the driveway in Charleston, just the same flat domestic assumption that had structured our marriage for years, as if I still existed in the place he had last put me. I sat down on the floor beside one of the boxes and read it again. "What do you want for dinner tonight?" For one suspended second, I almost laughed, not because any part of it was funny, but because the distance between his reality and mine had finally become impossible to miss. On Thursday night, he had told me I could leave. On Saturday, he had disappeared across town while I packed what mattered. On Monday, I had signed my name onto a house and a future he had spent 2 years postponing, and by Wednesday, he was texting me like a man asking whether I wanted takeout. My first impulse was not anger, it was clarity. Grant did not think in terms of rupture unless it inconvenienced him directly. That was why he had been able to move so casually between contempt and routine. In his mind, as long as he had not agreed that something was over, it remained intact. A second message came in before I could set the phone down. "You still mad?" There it was. Not concern, reduction. I could see the shape of the defense already forming even without hearing his voice. I was upset, overreacting, making things larger than they were, turning one bad night into a crisis. The language had not been sent yet, but it had lived in our marriage long enough that I knew exactly where it would go. Outside, a delivery truck slowed near the curb, then moved on. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked twice and stopped. The house around me held still. I stood up, walked to the dining room table, and laid out the stamped closing papers Daniel had told me to keep accessible. My name, the Savannah address, the date, the recorded transfer. Beside them, I placed the small envelope with the house keys and looked at them both for a long moment. This, I thought, was what he had never expected. Not that I would cry, not that I would beg, not even that I would leave the house for a few days. He had expected movement without consequence, anger without direction, silence that eventually folded back into obedience. Instead, there was paperwork, there was distance, there was a life with legal weight. When the phone buzzed a third time, I didn't pick it up immediately. I walked onto the front porch first, the paper still in my hand, and looked out at the quiet street lined with old oaks and parked cars. The late light fell across the porch rail in clean gold stripes. Then I unlocked my phone. Grant's third message was shorter than the first two. "Answer me." I looked down at the document in my hand, and for the first time since Thursday night, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I didn't answer his third message. Instead, I went back inside, set the papers flat on the dining table, and adjusted them until everything was clearly visible. The recorded date, the Savannah address, my full name printed in a line that looked steadier than I felt. Then I picked up my phone. The first photo I took was too close. The second caught too much glare from the window. By the third, I stepped back just enough for the edge of the table, the envelope with the keys, and the front doorway behind me to fall into the frame. I didn't smile. I didn't try to. I pressed send before I could overthink it. No caption, no explanation, just the image. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the 3 dots appeared. "Where are you?" Another message followed before I could lock the screen. "What is that?" And then, almost immediately, "Is this a joke?" I set the phone down without answering. The house stayed quiet, but something in the air had shifted, not externally, not in any way that would show up on paper or be visible to anyone walking past the windows, but internally in the way a boundary feels when it finally holds. The phone started ringing less than a minute later. Grant's name filled the screen. Once, twice, 3 times in a row, I let it ring out. Then a fourth call came in, and this time I answered not because I felt obligated, but because I needed to hear how far he was willing to go to keep the version of reality he had been living in. His voice came through tight and controlled, the kind of tone he used when he thought he was still managing a situation. "What is this?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I could hear movement on his end, a door closing, the muffled echo of a space that wasn't home. "Tessa," he said again, sharper now, "what is that picture?" "It's mine," I said. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. "What do you mean it's yours?" "The house," I said. "The papers." "They're mine." Another silence, longer this time. "That doesn't make any sense," he said finally. "You don't just go out and buy a house without talking to your husband." There it was. Not concern, not confusion, ownership. "I didn't need to," I said. The words landed between us with a weight I hadn't expected, not because they were loud, but because they were final. On the other end, I heard him exhale sharply. "Okay," he said, shifting tone, recalibrating. You're upset. I get that. Thursday was, look, it wasn't what you think. Ivy and I, we ran into each other. It got out of hand, but that doesn't mean you just, what is this? Some kind of move? You're trying to prove something? I leaned against the table, my hand resting on the edge of the papers. I'm not trying to prove anything, I said. I already decided. Another pause. Decided what he asked. That I'm not coming back. The silence that followed was no longer controlled. You don't mean that, he said faster now. You left for a few days, that's fine. People cool off. But you don't just walk out of a marriage over one night. You're blowing this out of proportion. I closed my eyes briefly, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I recognized the shape of the argument exactly as I had anticipated. It wasn't one night, I said quietly. He didn't respond to that. Instead, his voice shifted again, harder now. Where are you, Tessa? I didn't answer. You need to come back so we can talk about this in person, he continued. We have a lease, we have joint accounts. You can't just disappear and start making decisions like this. That's not how this works. The words settled in the room heavier than anything else he had said. For the first time since I sent the photo, the risk became concrete, not emotional, structural. He wasn't asking me to come back. He was telling me what he believed I was still bound to. I looked down at the papers again, at the date, the signatures, the legal language that had already moved my life in a direction he could no longer interrupt. I know how it works, I said. Then I ended the call. The phone rang again almost immediately, but I didn't pick it up this time. Instead, I gathered the papers, slid them back into their folder, and placed the keys inside the envelope. Because whatever Grant said next, however he tried to frame it, minimize it, or pull it back into something manageable, he had finally seen what I had done, and there was no version of that he could undo with a conversation. By Thursday morning, I had stopped expecting the phone to stay quiet. Grant had called 6 more times after I hung up the night before. He left no voicemail, which told me more than any message could have. Men only leave voicemails when they still believe they are explaining themselves. Silence after repeated calls meant something else. It meant he had moved past explanation and into calculation. I sat at the built-in desk in the dining room with Daniel Mercer's checklist open beside me and a yellow legal pad in front of me. The house was still unfamiliar enough that every small sound carried the hum of the refrigerator, the settling creak in the hallway, the distant rush of traffic from a busier street 2 blocks over. It helped me think. The problem wasn't whether Grant believed I was serious anymore. The photo had solved that. The problem was that I had let him know too much too quickly. He now understood 3 things: that I was in Savannah, that I had signed the papers, and that I meant to stay gone. What he did not yet understand was how much of the rest of my life had already been moved out of his reach. That distinction mattered. Daniel had written one sentence at the top of his email in a way that felt less like legal advice and more like survival. Do not confuse a boundary with an announcement. I read that line 3 times. Then I went through everything that still connected me to Charleston with a colder eye than I had used before. Lease records, joint utility accounts, automatic payments, my forwarding request, the small practical doors through which chaos liked to enter when people assumed the major decision was the only one that mattered. At 10:15, Brooke called. "Don't panic," she said immediately, which of course made my stomach tighten. I got a text from someone in Charleston who knows someone at Grant's company. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. What happened? Nothing final, she said, but apparently there was some kind of internal flag on his expense reports. Weekend reimbursements, meals mileage, a couple hotel charges that didn't match the client log. I didn't say anything. Brooke filled the silence carefully. I'm not saying this has anything to do with you. I'm saying if he's been sloppy in more than one part of his life, other things may be starting to catch up. That landed with a strange steadiness. Not triumph, not yet, just structure. For the first time since Thursday night, the pressure I felt was no longer coming from my own private decisions alone. Something outside of me had started moving, not because I had staged it, not because I had asked for it, but because men who live on assumptions usually carry them everywhere, including into the systems they think will protect them. After I hung up with Brooke, I sat back down and made a second list. Not of what I was leaving, but of what I still needed to secure before Grant decided to turn inconvenience into retaliation. By noon, I had updated my mailing address with my bank, moved the remaining teaching materials from my cloud account into a separate folder, and emailed the landlord in Charleston to ask that all communication about the lease be copied directly to me in writing. No accusations, no explanations, just a clean paper trail. At 1:30, another message came in from Grant. "So, this is what you're doing, running away and trying to make me look like the bad guy." I looked at the screen and saw more clearly than ever how quickly his language had shifted. First domestic routine, then dismissal, now preemptive blame. I didn't answer. 20 minutes later, Ivy's name flashed across my phone for the first time. I had never saved her number, but I knew who it was from the area code and the brittle politeness in the text. "I don't know what Grant told you, but I don't want to be dragged into your marriage issues." I read it once, then set the phone down very gently. There it was, the first crack in the arrangement that had humiliated me in public and hidden itself in private. Ivy was already stepping backward, not toward truth, not toward decency, but toward distance, toward self-protection. And that told me something important. Whatever Grant had built between charm habit and assumption, it was not stable under pressure. By late afternoon, the panic of the last 24 hours had thinned into something more useful. A plan, not a dramatic one, not a clever trap, just the quiet, necessary work of closing every door he might still believe was his to walk through. When the light began to fade across the dining room table, I slid Daniel's checklist back into its folder and looked around the house again. The boxes were still there, the walls were still bare, nothing about it looked finished. But for the first time, neither did I, and that was no longer a weakness. It was an advantage. By the following Tuesday, the pace of everything had changed. Not outwardly, not in the dramatic way people imagine when they talk about someone's life falling apart. There were no slammed doors for me to witness, no public confessions, no scene I could stand back and watch from a safe distance. What there was instead was paper, email, timing, silence in the right places, pressure applied by systems that did not care about charm. Daniel Mercer had arranged a formal meeting in Charleston that afternoon, not with Grant alone and not in our old house, but in a conference room borrowed from another attorney's office downtown, the kind of neutral space designed to remove emotion from people who no longer trusted themselves with it. I drove up that morning from Savannah with the folder on the passenger seat beside me, and my phone turned face down the entire way. Grant was already there when I arrived. He looked like a man who had slept in his clothes or not at all. Same watch, same wedding band, same expensive coat, thrown on as if appearance could still do some of the work his words no longer could, but something in him had shifted. Not guilt, not humility, exposure. His attorney, a younger man with careful hair and the exhausted look of someone already regretting the client in front of him, stood when Daniel and I entered. Grant stayed seated for 1 second too long, then rose as if remembering too late that other people were in the room. No one shook hands. The lease file was opened first. That part was almost insultingly simple. My name had been the primary guarantor from the beginning, a detail Grant had ignored because he had never needed to think about who made stability possible as long as he benefited from it. Daniel laid out the dates, the payment history, the written notice requirements. I would be removed only through formal amendment or termination. Until then, all communication had to be copied to both parties in writing. No verbal side deals, no confusion later. Grant interrupted twice both times to say he didn't see why this needed to get ugly. Daniel did not raise his voice. He only asked whether Grant was disputing the documents in front of him. He wasn't. The next file took longer. Joint utilities, shared auto payments, household accounts. Daniel had prepared a separation ledger so cleanly that even I felt something harden in me as he turned each page. What had once felt like a life woven together now looked exactly like what it had become, a set of obligations, responsibilities, and records that could be untangled if someone was willing to stop pretending. Grant kept trying to turn toward me instead of the paperwork. "Tessa, this is insane," he said at one point. "You're acting like I did something unforgivable." I didn't answer. Daniel did. "This meeting is not for character debate, it is for separation of obligations." That was the moment Grant lost the room, because everything after that became measurable. At some point, his phone lit up on the conference table. He glanced down and his face changed before he could stop it. Not much, just enough. He turned the screen over immediately, but I had already seen the notification banner from his company email. Mandatory meeting, attendance required, 2 words beneath it that explained the look on his face better than anything else could have. Compliance review. He must have known I saw, because from then on, his anger sharpened into something less stable. He stopped arguing like a husband and started talking like a man counting exits. By the time the meeting ended, the outline of his new reality was visible, even if no final judgment had been entered yet. Written communication only, financial separation underway, lease exposure documented, and somewhere outside that conference room, a company he had assumed would absorb whatever version of him he brought to it was beginning to ask questions he could not charm away. As Daniel and I walked out into the cooler, late afternoon air, my phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. It was Ivy. "Please tell your lawyer not to contact me. I'm not involved in whatever Grant has going on." I read it once and handed the phone to Daniel without comment. He glanced at the message, handed it back, and said, "That's useful. Useful." That was the word that stayed with me all the way back to the parking garage. Not satisfying, not vindicating, not enough to make anything feel lighter, just useful. Because by then the stakes were no longer about whether Grant would admit the truth. They were about how much of his life had been built on the assumption that no one would ever require it from him in writing. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in late June, under the kind of white Savannah heat that made everything look still from a distance. By then, the sharpest part was already over. Not because the paperwork had been easy, it hadn't. Not because Grant had suddenly become reasonable, he hadn't, but because the shape of the ending had stopped being negotiable long before the judge signed the final order. By the time we stood in that quiet courtroom, the facts had already done what facts do when they are written down, dated, and placed in front of people who no longer have the luxury of pretending. Grant lost more than he expected. The compliance review at work had not ended with a warning. Daniel never told me every detail, and I never asked for them, but I knew enough. His reimbursement privileges had been suspended first, then his position. By the time the divorce was final, the title he had worn like armor was gone. So was Ivy. She had stepped back the moment pressure touched her. No grand confession, no apology, just distance. A retreat so quick and clean it exposed what their connection had really been made of. Whatever Grant thought he was protecting when he chose her over the life we had built, it had not stayed beside him once the cost became public and practical. That, in the end, was the karma of it. Not humiliation for the sake of humiliation, not some theatrical downfall I could point to with satisfaction, just consequence. The kind that arrives when a person lives too long on borrowed loyalty and mistaken entitlement. I did not feel triumphant when it was over. I felt finished. That afternoon, after I stepped out of the courthouse, I drove back to the White House in Savannah with the windows up and the air conditioning humming softly through the vents. There were still more things to do: a mailing address to confirm, one final bank form to sign, a licensing packet for the studio to send before the end of the month, real life waiting without drama. When I pulled into the driveway, the new sign had already been mounted beside the walk: Whitmore Children's Studio. The letters were simple: clean navy on white, nothing flashy, nothing that asked for admiration, just a name and a place and the quiet proof that something could belong to me without needing to be defended every day. I stood there for a long moment with my keys in my hand. The carriage house and back was ready now: soft rugs, low shelves, 2 small chairs by the reading corner, a cabinet of sensory materials I had chosen piece by piece without anyone telling me to wait until later. The space smelled faintly of fresh paint and cedar, and for the first time in years I could feel my future, not as a distant concept, but as a room I had already entered. Brooke came by with iced tea just before sunset and sat with me on the back steps while the heat began to lift. She didn't ask how I felt about Grant. She knew better than that. Instead, she looked around the yard at the lights beginning to come on inside the studio and said, "You know what the real difference is?" I turned toward her. "You didn't just leave him," she said. "You chose yourself in writing. That was the truth of it." I had spent years thinking dignity was something you preserved by enduring quietly, by being reasonable, by not asking too much, by waiting for another person to become who they had once promised to be. It took me far too long to understand that dignity can also look like a signed document, a changed address, a phone left unanswered, a room built for the life you were told was inconvenient. When the sky darkened fully over Savannah, I went inside and locked the front door, not out of fear, but because it was mine to lock. And for the first time since that Thursday night in Charleston, I felt something softer than relief: peace. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, I'd love to know what helped you see the difference. If this story stayed with you, you can like, subscribe, and stay for the next one. There are always more stories about justice, family, and the quiet ways people begin again.